Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank everyone for joining us here this morning, and I want to especially thank our witnesses for being here today and coming in from all the way from Pennsylvania and Iowa to be here. Truly grateful, and our friend from the UAW being here as well. Again, very grateful you all made the time. As a congresswoman from Iowa's 1st Congressional District in Iowa, I grew up in a union family, and I also have a sister and brother-in-law who are corn and soybean farmers. I've watched firsthand the last few years as retaliation from the current trade wars have caused unease, uncertainty, and economic losses across the heartland. Now, trade issues are coming to the forefront of national conversations with implications for nearly every sector of our economy. And we see a number of escalating impacts from current trade negotiations with our major trading partners. Small businesses, which I like to remind folks are also our farmers, make up 97% of U.S. exporters. I look forward today to hearing about what you all think of the state of trade for our farmers, some of which who are here today, and also working families. And again, grateful to have a representative from the UAW here today as well, who are critical to small and large businesses in numerous trade-impacted industries. We also want to understand what you want to see out of future trade agreements, as Congress also learns more about the President's renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, or USMCA, as it's now called, and our trade negotiations as they are ongoing with China, Japan, and the European Union. It is no secret that farmers and working families are the backbone of our agriculture economy. In Iowa, our agriculture and manufacturing economy go hand in hand. If our farmers are doing well, so are our working families, and vice versa. And large and small manufacturers, like our UAW workers who work on farm equipment at John Deere. Their sustained success is critical for communities in Iowa and the rest of the country. To promote success in rural America, we must ensure we have trade policy that helps us export goods, but also protects our workers, communities, and production. Trade issues are obviously very important to me. They are to you all here today, which is why our first hearing in this subcommittee on rural development, agriculture, trade, and entrepreneurship was also on trade and the State Trade and Export Promotion Program. And now our second hearing is also on trade. Whether it's purchasing the latest iPhone, selling pork or soybean abroad, or buying a car, every American is impacted by trade policies. Our farmers and workers make the Hawkeye State the country's 2nd largest agriculture exporting state, shipping $10.9 billion in agriculture exports abroad in 2016. In my district alone, nearly 14,000 people make their livelihoods in agriculture. Again, some of my own family. We also have union members in my family, and it's not uncommon in Iowa to have both. Oftentimes, in small family farm operations under 500 acres, you'll also have UAW and IBEW members who work hard every day with pride on that family farm, and also in their union job that provides good health care and great retirement. Our farmers and our workers also know some challenges can come with trade. We need to understand how the two are often interlinked. Agriculture and workers in manufacturing and transportation, for example. So when we are renegotiating trade deals, we do so in a way that lifts up all Americans. We should stand up to countries that are not playing by the rules and lean on our allies for strength. We also must take advantage of every opportunity we have to ensure that American workers, jobs, and their livelihoods are being considered. Ill-conceived trade policy can produce trade wars that create instability. In the simplest terms, trade wars can easily become a tax paid by every American, decreasing exports and slowing economic growth. bad trade deals or lack of accountability can hurt communities and American workers. It is vital we retain access to new and expanding markets, but also use our economic power to ensure that the American worker and our farms and businesses are competing on a level playing field. In our global economy, 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the US. And for our rural entrepreneurs and our farmers, the ability to do business overseas is key. But we know more work needs to be done when only 1% of our nation's 30 million small businesses are able to access foreign markets. More needs to be done when other nations undercut American workers and hurt our domestic business. In Congress, we need to think about trade as making it easier for farmers and small employers to succeed in the international marketplace while also protecting our workers. It is my hope we can do both, and quite frankly, we must. And we need a thoughtful approach. The farmers and small businesses in my district simply want a level playing field on which to compete, and they want to be heard. We need to start by doing more listening in Congress on trade. We want to hear more from the administration on trade as well. Congress is supposed to have a role in trade agreements, so it's important that the subcommittee here raises these issues when we can to get this dialogue going and really uplift what's happening with trade and tariffs and the real on-the-ground impact that our communities across our country are facing. Congress is just, again, starting to hear from the administration on trade, and the USMCA agreement has not yet been delivered to Congress, which is why this hearing is so important. In much of the country, there are agriculture interests and hardworking Americans whose economic interests are linked. If our farmers are not doing well, again, they are less likely to buy a new tractor, which again are made in the heartland by our union members. Iowa State University estimated that the trade wars will cost Iowa alone $1 to $2 billion in losses. Trade deals impact all of our congressional districts, and that's why we're here today. I want to do some listening and fact-finding on the state of trade right now and where our witnesses think Congress and the president should be going to have their back. I hope we all take today's testimony to heart and prioritize your concerns through our actions here in Congress. And I hope we all take our fellow committee members' comments to heart as well, even if we may disagree with different positions. With that, I want to thank again each of the witnesses for joining us here today and coming all of this way, and I look forward to your testimony. I'd now like to yield to our ranking member, Dr. Joyce, for his opening statement.
First of all, thank you, Madam Chairwoman Finkenauer. This hearing is incredibly important, and a special thanks to Mr. Glenn Stoltzfus from Pennsylvania 13 in Somerset County for joining us here this morning. American farmers simply nourish our families, both here and across the world. On average, 20% of total agricultural production value is sold on international markets. Some commodities, such as cotton, are almost entirely dependent on overseas customers. The benefits of agricultural trade expand well beyond the cotton industry. In 2017, $138 billion of agricultural exports generated an additional $179 billion in economic activity. I'll repeat that. Generated $179 additional in economic activity. This resulted in the total economic output of over $300 billion. The industry supported 1.1 million full-time civilian jobs, which included almost 800,000 jobs off of the farm. Farms and businesses along the export chain have evolved to meet global demand. They must weather fluctuations in commodity prices, the global economy, and also trade dynamics. In 2018, the industry was hit with retaliatory tariffs on nearly 1,000 food and agricultural products, with an estimated impact of $11 billion. To mitigate damage suffered by U.S. producers, USDA Secretary Sonny Perdue initiated a $12 billion assistance package that is being delivered through 3 temporary programs. Today, we are here to examine how trade disruptions impact agriculture and resonate impacts on the rural and the national economy. Thank each of our distinguished witnesses from Iowa and Pennsylvania, and I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Joyce. The gentleman yields back. And if committee members have an opening statement, we would ask they be submitted for the record. I would now just like to take a few minutes to explain the timing rules. Each witness gets 5 minutes to testify, and members get 5 minutes for questioning, although we may have a second round of questions as well, since we're so grateful you're here and we want to make sure we use our time wisely. There is a lighting system in front of you to assist you. The green light comes on when you begin, and the yellow light means there's 1 minute remaining. The red light comes on when you're out of time, and we ask that you stay within that time, or that 5 minute time frame, to the best of your ability. And now I'd like to introduce our witnesses. I'm so excited again to have 2 folks from my district here today, along with an expert actually on trade from the UAW, or the United Auto Workers Union. We also have a good amount of dairy in Northeast Iowa, so I look forward to hearing from Mr. Stoltzfus as well. Our first witness I'm going to be introducing is Mr. Mark Murick. Mr. Murick is a pork producer from Protivin, Iowa, and is currently serving as the District 3 Director for the Iowa Pork Producers Association. Mr. Murick and his brothers, Joel and Dennis, own and manage Farmers Mill, Inc., a grain, feed, and seed and fertilizer center serving Northeast Iowa. His father started the business as a small feed bagging facility in 1964, and the business has grown to a large commercial grain elevator serving 3 counties. Mark is active in the Iowa Pork Producers Board, among other organizations, in Howard County, which is one of our most northern counties in Iowa 1. Mr. Murick is married to Wendy, and they have 3 sons, one of which is involved in the business. And I also have to say, I found out yesterday that Mr. Murick is also the nephew of one of my late my late grandmother's dear friends, who used to bring her communion when she was 6. So Iowa is, yes, definitely like a small town, no matter where you're at. So thank you again, Mr. Murick, for being here. And then our second witness is Rebecca Dostal. Ms. Dostal is a farmer in Tama County, Iowa. Her operation is around 700 acres just outside Traer, Iowa. She raises corn, soybeans, Berkshire hogs, and cattle. Ms. Dostal is an active member and former president of the Tama County Farm Bureau, a 4-H leader, which my brother and sister were able to participate in. But I, unfortunately, got sucked into softball and t-ball, I guess. I don't know. And which I wasn't good at either. So, and is actively involved in an ag women's group called Women, Land, and Legacy. In addition to farming, Ms. Dostal is also a substitute teacher for both the South Tama and North Tama school districts. She has an education degree from Iowa State University, and she and her husband also raised 3 boys on their Tama County farm. Welcome, Ms. Dostal. Our third witness is Mr. Josh Nassar. Mr. Nassar has served as the legislative director for the UAW since December 2011. The legislative department is responsible for implementing the union's policy agenda and designing the legislative strategy on labor, trade, budget, healthcare, defense, immigration, tax policy, and other issues. I don't know if there's anything you don't do, Mr. Nassar, but he works closely with members of Congress, the executive branch, and stakeholders. Mr. Nassar and his wife, Amy, live in the District of Columbia with their daughters, Naomi, Justice, and Janice. Welcome, Mr. Nassar. I would now like to yield to our ranking member, Dr. Joyce, to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I am proud to introduce one of my constituents, one of the hardworking dairy farmers from Pennsylvania 13, Mr. Glenn Stoltzfus. Glenn and his 3 brothers, Donald, Dwight, and Dwayne, operate a 700-cow dairy in Berlin, Pennsylvania, which is in Somerset County. The family also farms approximately 1,700 acres growing corn, soybeans, alfalfa, and grass hay, in addition to growing all their forages and high-moisture corn. Glenn serves as the executive committee of the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau's Board of Directors. He also chairs Pennsylvania Farm Bureau's Dairy Committee and serves on the U.S. House and Senate legislative committees. Now, this is a gentleman who gets up most mornings at 1 or 2 or 3 a.m., as confirmed by his wife, who's present here today. But don't ask him to do anything this coming Saturday, because he's going to be driving his daughter's championship basketball team in the Maple Fest parade in Myersdale. The Maple Festival Parade is an annual tradition, and his daughter, Rain, was one of the participants in the Lady Mountaineers, and I have to make special note, when a small-town team wins a state championship, it's a big deal in our world. Again, congratulations to the parents, and especially to Rain. Thank you for being here. Thank you for imparting what you do in the dairy industry to this committee, and I yield back to the chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Myrick, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Finkenauer and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to testify on behalf of more than 60,000 U.S. pork producers. My name is Mark Merrick, and I'm a farmer from Pearl River, Iowa. My wife and I raise pigs and grow crops, including corn and soybeans. I'm a member of the Howard County Pork Producers, the Iowa Corn Growers, the Iowa Soybean and Ag Business Associations of Iowa. U.S. pork is a major contributor to the agricultural and overall U.S. economy. Today, U.S. pork producers provide 26 billion pounds of safe, wholesome, and nutritious meat protein to consumers worldwide. Exports of pork add to the bottom line of each pork producer and support approximately 110,000 jobs in the U.S. pork and allied industries. In 2018, U.S. pork exports were valued at nearly $6.3 billion and represented over 25% of the U.S. production. The biggest driver of increased exports over the past 3 decades has been free trade agreements, which eliminate or reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers to U.S. exports. In fact, we export more pork to the 20 nations with which the United States has FTAs than to the rest of the world combined. The U.S. pork industry has the dubious distinction of being on 3 retaliation lists, 2 with China and 1 with Mexico. China and Mexico are very important export markets for U.S. pork. In China, we already had a 12% tariff on pork imports. We now face a combined duty of 62% in response to the United States imposing tariffs on imports of steel and aluminum and China's theft of U.S. intellectual property and its forced technology transfers. On June 5, 2018, Mexico, where U.S. pork previously shipped product at a 0 tariff rate under NAFTA, imposed a 10% duty on pork tariffs in response to U.S. steel and aluminum import tariff. That retaliatory tariff increased to 20% 1 month later. According to Iowa State economist Dermot Hayes, the pork industry stands to lose the entire Mexican market if we continue to face the 20% punitive tariffs. Retaliatory tariffs have cost U.S. pork producers $12 per animal, translating into industry-wide losses of $1.5 billion annually. As the world's most competitive producer of pork, the United States was anticipating increases in access to Japan and Vietnam under Trans-Pacific Partnership. These export prospects are also what prompted construction of 5 new pork packing plants across rural America. Unfortunately, restricted market access from ongoing trade disputes is making it increasingly difficult for U.S. pork producers to respond to uncertain export conditions. Producers are eager to see ratification of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. We are very pleased that the USMCA preserves 0 tariff rate for pork in North America. Under the terms of our previous agreement with North American trading partners, Mexico and Canada became our #1 and #4 volume export markets, respectively. In fact, those 2 countries account for 40% of all U.S. pork exports. The U.S. metal tariffs have opened the door for some of our largest competitors in Mexico to enjoy duty-free access. Professor Hayes of Iowa State looked at the possibility of U.S. pork finding alternative markets and concluded that without the Mexican market, it would be left with a net loss of about 600,000 tons of pork, or 5% of the total U.S. production. A loss in exports to Mexico of that magnitude would be catastrophic for U.S. pork industry and for all American agriculture. Keep in mind that Canadian retaliation against U.S. pork remains a possibility as long as it faces the U.S. metal tariffs. In addition to calling for a swift resolution of the current trade dispute with Mexico and Canada, pork producers have been urging the Trump administration to begin negotiating new free trade agreements, particularly with Japan. For now, Japan is the #1 export market based on value for U.S. pork. Last year, it concluded 2 trade agreements that have begun to erode U.S. market share in Japan. A U.S. free trade agreement in Japan would restore U.S. pork's competitive position in a critical market, and this can't happen fast enough. Trade is vital to the success of U.S. pork producers, but tariffs on U.S. pork exports to 2 of our top 3 markets, no clear timeline for new trade agreement negotiations with Japan and other key markets, uncertainty surrounding the ratification of USMCA, and growing competition from other pork-producing nations have U.S. pig farmers like me more than a little worried. The bottom line is that U.S. pork is shouldering a disproportionate share of trade retaliation against the United States. My fellow producers and I need relief. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Merrick. And we now recognize Ms. Dostal for 5 minutes.
Ms. Chairwoman, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. My name is Rebecca Dostal. I am a farmer from Tama County, Iowa. Our operation is around 700 acres just outside of Traer, Iowa, where we raise 3 boys, corn, soybeans, Berkshire hogs, and cattle. I am honored to have the opportunity to submit comments regarding trade and how it impacts agriculture in rural America. Rural America and the rural way of life is something I am deeply passionate about. I am active in our community as a member and former president of the Tama County Farm Bureau, a 4-H leader, and I am actively involved in an ag women's group called Women, Land, and Legacy. In addition to farming, I am also a substitute teacher for both South Tama and North Tama school districts. Agriculture and rural communities provide a lifestyle and value system that is very important to me and my family, and I believe that without international trade, that lifestyle is not sustainable. Our way of life deeply depends on foreign consumers and international markets. In order for us to operate in Tama County, Iowa, we must be able to feed those living in Hong Kong, Mexico, Mexico City, and Cairo, or our farm will not survive. As I am sure you are all aware, agriculture is tremendously important to Iowa. We rank first in the nation in corn and hog production and second in soybean production. In our state, agriculture directly employs 330,000 jobs. Last year, Iowa produced over 2.5 billion bushels of corn and 698 million bushels of soybeans. That's a lot of grain. Ultimately, we need to find somewhere for that grain to go. On average, the U.S. has exported 42% of our soybeans and 14% of our corn. Our top export countries have been Mexico, Japan, and South Korea for corn, and China, Mexico, and the Netherlands for our beans. Historically, we have relied on foreign markets to export our grain, and those foreign consumers have allowed agriculture, including farms like mine, to grow. However, this year, that dynamic has not been as reliable. Since the retaliatory tariffs have hit, we have seen the price of beans drop below the price of production, hog exports have slowed, and any hopes of expanding our operation have evaporated. The tariffs have hit us back home in the heartland in a very real way that has a ripple effect throughout our community. Every year, farmers go to their bankers to set up a projected cash flow plan for the upcoming crop year. A typical farmer will use an operating note to borrow cash to pay for that year's expenses. With seed, fertilizer, and equipment purchases often all coming at the same time, cash flow on the farm is difficult without these operating loans. When we sat down with our banker and did our budget in January of 2018, we used the projected pricing models that everyone uses to determine what level of financing we needed. We are always cautious to make sure that we do not overborrow and only borrow what we need. The problem is, no level of caution and no pricing models could predict a trade war. When the tariffs hit, the price of beans crashed almost $2 a bushel, and the price of corn dropped almost $1. An average acre in Iowa produces around 200 bushels of corn and 57 bushels of soybeans. So on an average acre, the farmer lost almost $200 an acre on corn and $114 an acre on soybeans. That deep of a drop often causes a farmer from having a profit to losing money. Today, the price of soybeans is below the cost of production, and the price of corn is hovering around an even cost. Because the loss of revenue at the end of the 2018 crop year, we did not have enough money to pay back our operating loan. Ultimately, we had to refinance our operating loan using other equipment and possessions as collateral. Luckily, we are diversified so we can make up our crop losses in other areas like cattle and hogs. But when it is that dramatic, it makes things difficult. It will stop us from purchasing equipment upgrades, expanding our herds, or acquiring more land. The trade aid payments that were made from the USDA helped cover some of our losses, but not nearly all of it. Without the trade aid, we would not have been able to come close to covering operating costs. While we appreciate the assistance, we would much rather be paid a fair price by the market rather than be paid restitution by the government for the trade war. Going forward, with inputs staying high, prices staying low, and no end to the trade war with China in sight, things do not look great on my farm. This year, I am subbing more than ever to make up for losses on the farm, but substitute teaching doesn't supplement my life ultimately. We are small farmers, and that is what our livelihood depends on. My ultimate worry is how this impacts Iowa, Tama County, and our community of Traer. I see how it impacts our rural schools and our rural community. We are losing rural population, our towns are shrinking, and our community is slowly dying. If you are a small farmer like me and you can't make a living in agriculture, you have no option but to leave. I strongly believe in the rural way of life, and with today's economics, sadly, it may not exist for much longer. We need trade to sustain our farmers, our towns, and our communities. There is an easy solution to our trade woes. Trade deals like TPP, the USMCA, a trade agreement with the EU that includes agriculture, and a trade deal with China that is fair and predictable would expand our markets, help American farmers, and sustain our rural communities. Protectionist trade policies do not help Americans. It only hurts us in the heartland. With that, I thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I will happily take any questions that you have.
Thank you, Ms. Dostal. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Nassar for 5 minutes.
Thank you for having me, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the committee. I want to also thank you on behalf of our 1 million members and our President, Gary Jones, for this opportunity and for being able to participate in this important conversation. I think, first of all, when looking at trade, I want to talk about kind of what we're trying to achieve. For United Auto Workers, it's pretty clear. We're trying to make sure there's opportunities for more good-paying jobs in the United States. That is the bottom line when we look at trade agreements and every other policy area. And in order to achieve that, to really strengthen the middle class and make manufacturing jobs the jobs they used to be, we think it's important to look at all policy issues. You got to look at labor enforcement. You have to look at tax policy. Investments in workforce, and in many other things. We think that a holistic view is needed, but trade's an important part. Now, for auto workers, we're proud of the fact that we help make our members help make auto jobs middle-class jobs and bridge routes to the middle class. But that's less and less the case today, as wages in manufacturing has dropped. And dropped significantly in manufacturing in general, but in auto, it's been actually 29% drop in 15 years for real dollars. So that's pretty significant. And one of the reasons why NAFTA has been such a problem is because there's been a lot of manufacturing work, and the ag sector is not immune from this. There's been more ag production in equipment in Mexico as well. A lot of work has actually gone from U.S. to Mexico and then selling the exact same cars and other products back in the United States. That's one big reason. But another thing is that, NAFTA has been used as leverage to undermine union contracts and organizing campaigns with a constant threat of, if you push too hard, we're going to Mexico. And why is that such a problem? Well, in Mexico, there are very few independent unions, and the labor rights are really atrocious. Most of the unions there are company unions where the workers have no say, and in the contract, the terms of the contract are often signed to the contract without even voting on it or seeing it. And wages there for auto workers and manufacturing workers in general are often $2 to $3 an hour, and are totally insufficient to have be able to buy the products that they make. So looking forward, when it comes to USMCA or NAFTA 2.0, we think that there's been some progress, but some work remains, especially in regards to labor rights, because we're concerned about, while the labor chapter has some improvements from where we stand today, where there is no enforceable labor chapter, the enforcement mechanisms are not strong. and they rely on this dispute resolution mechanism, which has been completely ineffective for protecting workers' rights. So it really hasn't created a level playing field. So there needs to be strengthening of the enforcement of USMCA, and we encourage the administration to get back to the negotiating table and to make it a stronger deal than it is right now. As far as some other things that touch upon on trade, I'm going to have a minority opinion here on a trade deal with Japan, because while we certainly want the agricultural industry to prosper, we have, as you said, many members who work in building ag equipment and also suppliers for those main companies. We don't think auto should be part of a trade deal with Japan, because Japan has the most closed auto market in the world, in the developed world, and we already have about 100-to-1 ratio of imports to exports. In other words, 100 Japanese cars are imported here for every 1 car we sell there. They have the most closed market in the developed world. It's not just U.S. companies. All companies have not penetrated Japan's market, and they do it without tariffs. So for us, looking at it, we are worried that on the auto side, we could actually make 100-to-1 could be worse if we don't do this trade deal right with Japan. So we would encourage cutting the auto sector out. We also think that as far as the TPP is concerned, the labor chapter there is very weak, and that agreement, if it goes forward as it is now, would be bad for workers and for our economy as a whole. So to summarize, we really think that there doesn't have to be this idea where ag industry and manufacturing industry are seen as opponents in trade deals. The truth is that we want the ag sector to do well because it's important for our economy and country, but it's also important for the jobs of manufacturing that are important in Iowa, Illinois, and throughout the country. So thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Nassar. And now I recognize Mr. Stoltzfus for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Thank you, Chairwoman Finkenauer and Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to speak today on the state of the dairy industry and the benefits of trade agreements such as the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. My name is Glenn Stoltzfus, and I operate a 700-cow dairy in partnership with my 3 brothers in Berlin, Pennsylvania, Somerset County. My brothers and I also farm approximately 1,700 acres growing corn, soybeans, alfalfa, and grass hay. We grow all of our forages and high-moisture corn and often sell excess corn and hay. In addition to helping operate and manage our farm operation, I currently serve on the Pennsylvania Farm Bureau's Board of Directors, along with chairing Farm Bureau's State Dairy Committee. I offer testimony today on behalf of Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, an organization representing more than 62,000 farm and rural family members throughout Pennsylvania. Dairy farmers are the largest segment of producers within Pennsylvania Farm Bureau, and dairy is Pennsylvania's largest agricultural sector. And in other words, it's the largest component of one of the state's largest industries. However, across Pennsylvania and the nation, the dairy industry is in dire straits. Just last month, USDA reported approximately 2,700 dairy farms, nearly 7% drop, ceased operation nationwide in 2018. Nationally, Pennsylvania suffered the second most closures, with 370 dairy farms lost, a drop just under 6%. One of my neighbors was one of those farms, and I fear the downtrend will only continue. And unlike traditional businesses, the prior business can't simply be replaced with a new sign or fresh paint. Instead, many of these farms will permanently be lost, and with it, a way of life. Diverting further into the issue, a perfect storm of decreased consumer milk consumption, increased milk production nationwide, and a reversal of long-standing policies by governments to allow more domestic milk production have caused global oversupply of milk for a sustained period. As to consumption, in 2016, USDA projected the per capita consumption of beverage milk at an all-time low of 154 pounds per person, with per capita consumption of milk products falling by 25% over the last 20 years. In practical terms, all these factors have meant that the price American dairy farmers receive for milk has been lousy for a long time. And while input costs have remained level or even increased in some cases, in my case, my price per hundredweight of milk peaked at $26.80 in 2014 and went as low as $13.90 last year. The price has since improved to $17.30, but the future is uncertain and subject to numerous factors, including trade barriers. Compounding the problems, net farm income, a broad measure of farm profitability, is down over 50% since 2013, and presently at one of the lowest points in the last 2 decades. Thus, even diversified dairy operations such as mine have not been able to fully rely on other commodities to dampen the dairy despairs. Further, unresolved aluminum and steel trade threats the health of the national farm economy. Nevertheless, despite all these problems, one material way that can help dairy farmers is to increase export market access. Given its quality and efficiency and decades of cultivating trade partners, the U.S. agriculture industry has been incredibly successful in utilizing trade to benefit farmers and our nation as a whole, resulting in over 25% of all agricultural products being exported. Approximately 16% of all U.S. milk production was imported last year. In fact, agriculture is one of the few industries that exports more product than it imports, accounting for $21 billion trade surplus. Much of the nation's agriculture trade success has risen from relations with Mexico and Canada, which represent the top 2 agricultural trade partners for nearly every state in the nation, including Pennsylvania. Dairy is no different. Since 2015, Mexico and Canada have ranked 1st and 3rd, respectively, in export markets for U.S. dairy products. As a result, trade agreements involving Mexico and Canada are critical to our nation's agricultural industry, and the USMCA represents a chance to bring vital benefits to the industry, particularly dairy farmers. While not an all cure for the industry woes, if approved, USMCA will provide meaningful benefits for American dairy farmers. The agreement will increase dairy market access to Canada by 3.6%, a level even better than under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Some specific examples include an export increase of 50,000 metric tons of fluid milk by year 6 of the agreement, along with 12,500 metric tons of cheese, 10,500 metric tons of cream over the same time period. In total, the agreement is expected to increase dairy exports by 100,000 metric tons annually once fully implemented. Additionally, within 6 months of the USMCA's implementation, Canada has agreed to end its protectionist Class 7 pricing scheme that flooded the global market with subsidized skim milk and milk powder and lowered Canadian demand for U.S. ultra-filtered milk for cheese production. In turn, many American dairy farmers will benefit from the pricing scheme elimination of being able to compete globally on equal terms. USMCA also provide benefit beyond the dairy industry. Canada has agreed to treat wheat imports in the same manner as domestic wheat for grading and pricing purposes. Poultry exports will increase by 10,000 metric tons over a six-year period. Turkey exports can potentially increase by 1,000 metric tons each year for 10 years. Eggs and egg-equivalent products exports will increase by approximately 16% over a 6-year period. Finally, the USMCA includes provisions that enhance science-based trading standards for foundations for sanitary and phytosanitary means of agricultural products. The agreement is also the first of its kind to include provisions that address cooperation, information sharing, and other trade rules related to biotechnology and gene editing. As the administration negotiating USMCA, many farm groups issued a simple message of do no harm. Since its passage, NAFTA has worked incredibly well and brought benefits to agriculture, increasing U.S. agriculture exports to Canada and Mexico by approximately $30 billion. In our view, the administration has succeeded in doing no harm and done one better. Nearly all agricultural exports remain subject to zero tariffs. Significant and historical strides for the dairy industry have been made with Canada, and other commodities such as poultry and eggs have gained increased Canadian market access. Given these advancements, we urge Congress to finalize USMCA's passage. Beyond USMCA, the agreement provides a positive paradigm for future trade agreements, including potential noteworthy deals with Japan and the European Union, particularly given its emphasis on science-based sanitary standards and inclusion of biotechnology and gene editing. On the other hand, if USMCA's passage is substantially stalled or falls short, the administration is unlikely to negotiate similar gains in future trade deals. As mentioned, trade agreements in and of themselves are not a magic potion to fix all difficulties in the farm economy. But when meaningful, long-term improvements are negotiated, such agreements can provide significant benefits to a farmer's livelihood and help keep farm operations afloat during downturns. We believe USMCA is such an agreement. We believe USMCA will help American farmers, particularly dairy farmers, and we respectfully request Congress move forward on this passage. Thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to share my story on behalf of Pennsylvania farmers.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltzfus, and we'll begin with questioning, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I just, again, want to say thank you to every single person who came here today to testify. This is, quite frankly, heartbreaking right now with what's happening in the state of Iowa and also across the country after the last few years. And your testimony today is candid and brave, and I just truly thank you for all of your honesty and for being here today with us. So thank you, thank you. Now, one of the questions I want to ask first is to Ms. Dostal, and it has to do with the fact, I know you discussed a bit about financing, and I know this is something that a lot of our farmers, particularly in Iowa 1, are dealing with, where they're, it was last season and they're going and wanting to update equipment before harvest season, finding issues with banks, and I know, obviously that then has an impact on John Deere as well and our workers. So one thing I wanted to kind of chat about is, kind of highlighting some of these barriers you've been talking about in regards to financing. But is there anything that you think the USDA should be doing more of, or that the Small Business Administration could be doing to supplement the USDA efforts to help ease the situation when it comes to financing and loans? Yes.
So I think the biggest problems with like bankers or your private bankers is their hands are kind of tied as far as how much they can give out based on how much debt you already have. Going by what we had done, we did everything that we've done in the past 10 years, and you just couldn't foresee that we were going to have prices drop that fast. So, I was allowed to refinance my note using things that I already own, which obviously means, you're not going to be able to go and upgrade equipment or change things that you maybe would have done. I'm trying to increase my cattle herd, and, you're kind of maxed out on the limit that you can get. I don't know that the USDA probably can help, as far as, because you're already in that debt. So what they did with, when they went ahead, the USDA did give us, a stipend for the soybeans that we were to help kind of get by. But, you're still in the same boat this year. We've got prices so low right now. There's so many people now that are going to be planting corn just because bean prices are so low for futures. So I don't know, unless this trade war can end so that we can have the free trade and be able to be at an even playing field with Brazil and other countries that can sell that product to them. I don't know that it's going to make a difference by, we don't want a handout. That's not what we're here for. We would just like the opportunity to have that free trade.
Yeah. And Mr. Myrick, I know, or Myrick, we chatted a little bit about this yesterday as well. Do you have any thoughts on the financing portion or anything that you would like to see in regards to some of the loans?
Well, we're in a grain elevator business with my brothers, and we run into it daily. A couple years ago, when prices are above break evens, everything goes pretty smooth. Guys prepay their expenses, and at the end, if there's an operating note, they pay it off. And the last 2 years, especially since the tariff on soybeans, has been devastating. But we've been below break even on most all commodities: milk, corn, beans, hogs. So the bankers are nervous, and I'm not sure if the USDA or Small Business Administration would have some type of a guaranteed loan program, so that when the bankers are loaning money, they'd have a backstop, so that just in case things don't improve for unforeseen circumstances, maybe there would be a backstop through either small business or USDA. So we've had guaranteed loans in the past, and I don't know the statistics, but maybe 98% get repaid. I'm not sure, but a small portion maybe don't go the right way. But at least it would have a backstop for the local banks, yes.
Thank you. And Mr. Nassar, thank you so much again for being here today and bringing your very, very important perspective here that impacts my district as well in a very large way. So one of the things, I'm kind of curious about a couple things, but do you guys actually have numbers on how many of your farmers are, or so how many of your union members are actually also farmers? And then also wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you'd like to see to make sure that American workers actually have a more prominent voice in the trade process, and what changes you'd like to see in regards to trade authority.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I don't have any stats as far as how many of our members also work as farmers. I know plenty of our members who do work as farmers as well and come from agricultural communities. So I know that it's very much part of their lives and our lives as a union is having a prosperous agricultural sector. As far as what kind of policies are needed to strengthen middle class? I mean, there's a lot. We think one thing that's been a problem for us has been outsourcing, has been companies going overseas and plants closing. And we think more policies could be done to stop that, such as clawbacks could be done for corporations that take subsidies and then don't fulfill their promise, move overseas. We think there are provisions in the tax law which don't make sense, which actually make it so it's easier you pay lower U.S. taxes on your profits overseas than you do domestically. And then our labor laws are very weak as far as being able to enforce. They're largely toothless. So there's a lot needs to be done, I think. But first of all, when it comes to USMCA, we've got to have a new look at labor chapters, because what we have seen in manufacturing is wages have dropped, not just for U.S. auto workers, but for auto workers in all three countries since then. So that part really needs some work.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, I am out of time. But again, we'll do a second round of questioning here. And with that, I will yield to Ranking Member Dr. Joyce.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. My first question is for Mr. Stoltzfus. You had mentioned in your testimony some of the issues that plague the dairy farm, and many other dairy farmers whom I've been in contact with throughout Somerset and actually through the entirety of Pennsylvania 13 have talked to me how the dairy industry has been affected by the decreased use of dairy products. So some of the initiatives that I have been involved in is, first of all, to make recommendations that whole milk is returned to public schools. My concern, and what I hear from the dairy farmers, is that we've lost a generation of milk drinkers by allowing skim milk to be substituted. As a physician, as a parent, I understand that the nutritional values of milk can be carried in the small amount of fat that's in milk, that the vitamins A, D, E, and K are in that very small amount of fat that is in whole milk. That is needed for brain development, it's needed for muscle development, it's needed in the children in the public schools. Can you address how initiatives like returning whole milk into our public school can potentially increase dairy use and actually dairy prices?
Thank you. Yeah, I've often said that I think as you stated, we've lost a generation of people who used to drink milk, whole milk. Fluid milk is the class 1 milk that we receive the highest premium for. And in the northeast part of this country, we tend to sell a lot of our milk in that class 1 that goes for fluid milk. And as that consumption drops, we continue to lose that premium that is there for that class 1 milk. It's unfortunate what has happened in the schools and in the cafeterias where we've tried to push this skim and 1% milk. And to be honest with you, it's not good. It doesn't taste good. And when you take away that flavor, folks don't, you create habits when you're very young. And as you age, you tend not to change those habits. So in that way, yeah, we've lost a generation of folks that used to drink fluid milk. I think it's nature's most perfect beverage. So actually, I definitely agree with you. Getting whole milk back into schools would be a tremendous advantage to us as dairy farmers.
I'm going to follow up on that, Mr. Stoltz, with an additional question. The dairy industry has been hard hit with imitators in the dairy counter. So recently, with a member, I crossed the aisle and we wrote a letter to Gottlieb, the FDA secretary, addressing that in the dairy case, that dairy products should be present, that imitators of dairy products that are sold under the label of being milk or dairy shouldn't be allowed. Do you think this has had impact on your industry as well?
Absolutely. Years ago, you used to go to the beverage case in supermarkets, and a very large percentage of it was milk or milk products. Now we're in competition with all kinds of juices and other things, including the nut juice or whatever you want to call it, that's being called milk that does not come from a lactating animal. I believe that there is actually a law or a rule that in order to be labeled as milk, it has to come from a lactating animal, and it just is one that has not been enforced. And we certainly would appreciate that being enforced. And I think it would distinguish a difference between milk, which comes from a lactating animal, and those products or those drinks that do not.
Thank you for that clarification, and thank you for reminding us what we were all taught in 6th grade science class. I appreciate that. This question is for Ms. Dostal. Thank you for your input. Thank you for telling us how difficult it is on your farm. Do you feel that the Iowa Farm Bureau, which you mentioned, participates or encourages you to participate in promotion programs that would allow you to export your product? Is that part of your background in agriculture?
Yes, I've been on a market study tour where I went to Brazil through Iowa Farm Bureau. I'm very big in beef industry, so it was very eye-opening to see how Brazil raises their cattle down there, and we actually got to go to a packing plant and see everything, and they are a major competition in our exports. So the reason Farm Bureau does the market study tours is to educate us as producers so that we know what we're up against in the export market. So I think they really, a lot of different times they go on trips throughout the year trying to educate consumers and producers on what is happening in other parts of the world so that we know what we're up against when we are trying to produce our products and get them exported to those countries.
Thank you, and thank you for your hard work. Madam Chairwoman, I yield.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to recognize Congressman Jared Golden to be for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Stoltzfus? All right, thank you. Sorry, I want to make sure I get that right. So I grew up in a town in Maine, Leeds, Maine, where we had a lot of small dairy farming families, and there's still a few remaining, but a lot of them have moved on, sold their cows, and kind of a process of consolidation of sorts going on up there, particularly starting in the 90s. A lot of smaller operations in Maine. there's not a whole lot of surplus in the region, so we have essentially a situation where dairy is sent to Massachusetts for processing and returns to Maine for retail sale, and they do some value-added stuff like yogurt and artisanal cheeses and other things, mostly sold in the state or in the New England region. Most of the farms are organic, and a lot of them don't use bovine growth hormone. And I'm just curious from your perspective, it seems like under NAFTA we saw more, an increase in export, but in some ways smaller family farms in places like Maine struggling to survive and compete. And do you think, there's a connection there, or does that have more to do with things going on domestically? And is NAFTA, the renegotiated NAFTA USMCA, going to help the scenario that I was just describing? And if not, what kinds of domestic policies might help reverse the fortunes of smaller dairy farmers in places like Maine?
I'm not sure that there is a relation like between NAFTA and the loss of small dairy farms. Pennsylvania has also seen that. It's unfortunate, I think, when you start to lose those small dairies in the community, you start to lose your infrastructure, you start to lose the equipment dealers and that sort of thing. Unfortunately, there is the economics of scale. I think there is a place for small farms, and a lot of times it's like you said, it is that niche market, whether it's organic or local grown or whatever it is. In Pennsylvania, we are seeing kind of a resurgence of those niche markets, not necessarily just dairy, but other produce stands and the resurgence of farm markets. The farming industry is changing. And I don't know that that's a whole, a lot of that can be related to NAFTA or the USMCA deal that has been proposed.
Thank you. I had a conversation last October, I think it was, with a dairy farmer in Maine, thinking that he would be pleased with the new trade deal. But in his case, he didn't think that it would make much of a difference in the local market anyway, although it may be good for others around the country. But, he had a deep skepticism. I do want to agree with the ranking member, Dr. Joyce, talking about consumption and some of these things that we can do that might help out. I was talking to one of these former dairy farmers back home in Maine just this morning, and what he said was there's some overproduction problems and not enough consumption, and what we need is more consumption. And they used to refer to skim milk when I was young as white water. But, he essentially was saying that he educates his boys to put 3 liquids into their body's water, milk, and when they're of an appropriate age, beer. But part of the problem is of course that we're not consuming enough here locally. But a bit of a deep skepticism in Maine that opening up Canada to their market may not be big enough in terms of their demand to really fix the problem for us. But I do appreciate your testimony today and your feedback. We were talking a little bit earlier about cotton, actually. In my community, Lewiston, Maine, used to have textile mills, most of which are gone. In fact, almost all of them have left. And, so it's not a surprise to hear that cotton producers, farmers are relying upon export and trade at this point, because most of the processing in the United States, particularly in places up in New England, seems to have left the country. And I was just curious, Mr. Nasser, it seems like this is a common problem and something that your organization talks a lot about in regards to trade, where what we see is perhaps an increase in exports, but the fleeing of the manufacturing and processing side of things, whether we be talking about textiles, about food, or about things like auto. I'm just curious, is there anything about the USMCA that you think is going to stop the loss of those jobs leaving the U.S.? Because I think we all agree that we would like to see U.S. products being processed in America and then sold to American consumers and keep the jobs here, essentially.
Thank you for the question. It's really difficult to project what would come from it, because we haven't really seen any economic analysis. But I think as far as retaining jobs, I think that, but relying just on trade alone and the deal just in USMCA is insufficient. You also need to have surrounding policies. You need to have good tax policies, et cetera. I think one thing, though, to point out, though, is that, when you lose a manufacturing plant, it devastates the whole community. And it's not just the plant, it's all the suppliers. For example, in a car, about 75% of a car is made in the parts sector. Also, in the ag imp sector, a lot of the parts are really so it really has devastating impact. But I would just say that we need more analysis, more information to be able to make an educated guess. But it's really going to be hard to happen without a stronger labor chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. And I will now recognize Representative. You're not too far away, just a little bit north of Iowa there. I'll now recognize Representative Jim Hagedorn for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair, thank you. Appreciate the time. Ranking member, it's good to be here. Thanks for testimony, the witnesses' time. I'm sorry to be in late. Was over at an agriculture subcommittee meeting talking with the Undersecretary of Agriculture about trade. So kind of along the lines of what we're getting at here. You know, southern Minnesota, a lot of farmers, a lot of agribusiness, and highly dependent on making sure that they have markets around the world for the products. And I tell people that you know, kind of three aspects of what we want to do for our farmers. One is to knock down those barriers, and others to make sure we sustain farmers when times are tough, like with the Farm Bill, things like that. And then we also have to make sure we have good government. You know, when I grew up on a grain and livestock farm near Truman, Minnesota, I used to go out and walk the beans. They don't really do that much anymore, but we'd pull the weeds to make sure that the bean plant could get the proper nutrients, sunlight, and water, so it could thrive. We get the best yield possible. And we kind of have to do that here in Washington because there's a lot of bad government. We need to pull the weeds of government. And I agree with what you said. Tax policy is important, regulatory policy, Obamacare, which has been very tough on farmers, and energy policy. Make sure we have downward pressure on that. But a big part of what we're talking about here is making sure we knock down the barriers, we expand our trade, so we have the markets. And so I'd ask Mr. Stolfus, I'm sorry, I apologize for butchering that. The USMCA Act, I support that. I hope the Speaker will bring that up at the proper time. You do see that as a positive development, right, especially in the areas of agriculture?
Absolutely. I think it's stated in testimony that, you know, most farm organizations, when they went into the negotiations, we said do no harm. In other words, you know, NAFTA was very good to agriculture. But I think they've done one better. I think if this gets ratified, I think it will open up markets, particularly in the dairy industry, where Canada has been extremely protective of their dairy industry up there. When you go to Canada or you talk to a dairy producer and you start talking about dairy trade, the conversation ends right there. And if we can make any kind of stride there, I think it'll be a plus for dairy farmers.
Good deal. Mr. Merrick, I grew up on a hog farm as well, and as a matter of fact, Martin County, right next to where I live, is they call it the bacon capital USA. So you know, a lot of pork production. I think the second largest pork producing district in the whole country, and parts of you know, what we need to do as a government. Our role at the federal government is to protect agriculture from imports that could disrupt our markets. One of the things that's happening in China right now, it's pretty devastating, is this African swine flu, the virus. And we want to make sure that we protect our farmers here by not allowing that in the country as best we can. What about the concept of a vaccine bank? Do you think that should be fully funded? Do you think that would have a positive effect in the future should we have a problem?
Well, sure. African swine fever is a huge issue. There is no vaccine, and there won't be any vaccine for at least 10 years. So we're a long ways out on that. There was some legislation on vaccine bank in this farm bill, and it will relate to foreign animal diseases, but not specifically to African swine fever. That's a long ways out. But we'll still need help from the government to protect the borders, to keep stuff from coming in, any of the African swine fever. And they do that at airports. They got the Beagle patrols. There's various ways that they're going to help to try and keep that out, because the only way we can avoid African swine fever is to keep it out of our country. Once it's here, it's too late because, again, there is no vaccine for it. And it's going to take years. There's plenty of people working on vaccines, and they might need some government help for helping to fund some of that research, but it'll be a ways down the road. But if it does happen here, our exports stop immediately. So if we export 25% of our hogs, which we do, The day we have African swine fever come here, our exports are shut. So that would be huge. It would devastate the hog industry in the United States. So we have to, number one, we have to keep it out from coming across our borders. Is that?
I agree with that, and some people don't kind of follow that. If our hog production goes down, our exports, then also the corn and other things that feed the hogs, that's going to take a hit too. And our commodity prices along the way farmers are going to have a lot of bad repercussions.
Absolutely, just a string of dominoes. Exactly right. Yes.
A few years back, we had something a little similar in the pork industry, the hog community, and they thought that maybe a vaccine or something was far off, but it is remarkable how when people put their mind to it and we get the best scientists and others in the biotech communities working, that they can find something. So hopefully there'll be a breakthrough soon. But
yeah, I agree. And they're putting a lot of resources into it. This is a really tricky virus. They haven't worked on anything quite like this. So some of the viruses in the past, they have fairly short term gotten a solution, but this one is a really tricky one. And but you're right, they're putting their smartest people at it. So we're hoping for the best.
Appreciate that. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I'm going to recognize members who would like to ask a second question for 5 minutes as well. And I'll start by recognizing myself. Again, what you all are bringing up here today is so powerful and important that is heard in Washington. One of the things that keeps me up at night, and I'm sure many of you as well, are the long-term effects of what has now become a very long, drawn-out trade war process. I still will never forget actually where I was when I saw President Trump's tweet about the steel and aluminum tariffs 5 days before a special election in Pennsylvania, Mr. Connor Lamb's. And then about a month and a half after that was when we all of a sudden saw the retaliatory tariffs come from China that directly hit my state and our agriculture industry in a very big way. After that, obviously, then the discussions about the renegotiation of NAFTA. You've had, again, because of then the steel tariffs going on Canada as well, and Mexico, you then have the 20% tariff that Mexico throws on our pork industry. And here we are about a year and a half later, and I am very concerned about the long-term impacts, about what this has cost us, and wanting to make sure that the deals we are getting are truly going to be worth everything that our state has gone through. And I am concerned about that. I don't know if we're going to reach that. But I want to make sure, again, that we are doing everything to address these long-term effects after that has been happening over the last, again, year and a half. One of the things I want to touch on here is the impact of, our next generation of farmers who have been watching this occur, our workers who have been watching this occur, and what, especially when you're looking at, again, that the tariffs, the soybean tariffs from China. I mean, you've got China and Brazil creating new contracts. Brazil is deforesting as fast as they can to plant more soybeans, and that's just not going to go away. So these are the things I'm concerned about, and also wondering if you guys could each speak a little bit. I know we're a little limited on time here, but about a minute each of what you are seeing as what will be the long-term effects here, or things we might not even know until, 5-10 years down the road here. Mr. Murick, if you would like to start.
Well, as farmers and producers, we're used to risk. I mean, every day there's plenty of risk. What we don't need is extra unknown risk, unknown barriers that the tariffs presented. Like Rebecca said, when you go to your banker and you make a plan, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, here drops a tariff on top of your head. So there's the known unknowns and then the unknown unknowns. So when something falls out of the sky like a tariff, we have a hard time being able to process that. So what will happen is the smaller farmers, which we talked about before, the backbones of the community, they'll just give up. They'll get a job in town. They won't be able to get any more funding, and they'll dry up, and they'll just be two farmers farm the whole county. Maybe in 100 years it's going to be that way anyway. I'm not sure. But in the short term, for our communities, we'd like to keep it a little closer to the way it is now. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr.
Thanks.
Merrick. Yes, Ms. Dostal.
Yeah, I'd like to agree with Mr. Merrick. As a mother of 3 boys, I would not encourage my sons to come back to the farm. And that's sad because that is our rural communities. So I have a 16-year-old boy that I said, if you want to stay in agriculture, go into drones or, the agronomy side of it so that you can sell to the bigger producers. Because he's right. And probably in, the next 20 years, you're going to have the 2 biggest producers farming in the whole county. When we're already seeing that because we just can't compete with the rent prices and the things that are going on with the prices the way they are. So our biggest benefit is that we're diversified, and that's what I was always told, don't always keep all the same eggs in one basket. So we can try to make up for it in other things. Right now, cattle prices are good, but, with Brazil producing more cattle too, like you said, it's gonna start hurting somewhere else. So probably as far as the future of, our farming community, I think I was talking earlier, our high school graduates 35 kids. That's a small school, and we have a lot of them in Iowa. But you see the urban sprawl, you see the bigger towns just getting bigger, and that's because people aren't farming. They're finding jobs in town. So I think this is really hurting them.
Thank you, Ms. Dostal. Mr. Nassar.
Yes, thanks for the question. I do want to say that I think there is a role for enforcement, and that at times, enforcement policies are needed when there's flooding of markets and such. I would say for that to be effective, it has to be with many other countries, and that's probably, been something that's missing from the current policies. We've seen it's a little different manufacturing, but we have seen a real loss in confidence in manufacturing, and it continues to this day. For example, in spite of everything that's being done, General Motors announced that it's planning on closing 4 factories despite record profits, and we're seeing kind of a lack of confidence in manufacturing. So that's partly related to the trade policies, and it's something that really has to get turned around quickly.
Thank you. And Mr. Stoltzfus.
Thank you for the question. I tend to think that, for years we've complained in the ag industry that we haven't been able to play on a level playing field. And the policies of past administrations, I'm going back 20, 30 years, really haven't been a whole lot different from one to the other when it comes to ag trade. This administration is trying something different, and yeah, it hurts. And we have yet to see whether or not it is actually beneficial or not. If in the end it comes out we can play on a more level playing field with the rest of the world, we'll be far ahead. I think here in America we have the ability to outproduce anybody. Because of the innovation, the technology we have. And I tend to think right now, although the prices are bad in just about every commodity, the future of ag is tremendous. The technology that is there and the things that kids can get involved in, people coming out of school, it's different. It's not going to be the same way. It's changing, and we can't stop change. So we need to adapt to it. I think the future of ag is bright, and I think it will continue to be that way.
Thank you, Mr. Stoltzfus. And I'd now like to we just have Mr. Golden now. Recognize Mr. Golden for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I like this discussion that we're having about labeling and what we call our products. And I agree again with the ranking member when it came to the issue of what we call milk. I actually signed on to that letter as well. Almond milk, not milk, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, Mr. Merrick, I wanted to ask you a little bit about this new NAFTA deal and some of the concerns that I have. Wasn't sure if you might agree, and if you were in charge for a day, if you might have pushed for some additional changes that could be good for you. But back home, where I come from, people take a lot of pride in Maine-made, American-made, products. They like to know what they're purchasing, and given a choice between buying something from away or something that's here from the U.S., they'll often side with the U.S. even if prices are a little bit higher. and within reason, of course. But I was surprised that the negotiators for this deal didn't try to restore the country of origin labeling. And I know that's something that Canada and Mexico complained about to the World Trade Organization. But I was hoping that this would be an opportunity to try and, in this new negotiation, pull them to the table and try and get them to drop their complaints. Would it be a benefit to the pork industry to be able to label your products as made in the USA?
Well, I'm just speaking for myself here. I don't know official position in NPPC. I don't represent them directly, but no, I would say no. In our industry, wherever it comes from, it's all federally inspected. It's going through inspection process. So really, where it comes from, as long as it passes our inspection, for the most part, is good. In the packing plants, and as a producer, if I was getting feeder pigs from Canada, which happens frequently, it creates a bottleneck then of, is that an American hog? It was born in Canada, but it comes here at 20 days old, and I have them for the next 100 days. So is that a product of Canada or a product of the U.S.? So right away there's trouble. You get to the packing plants where they're trying to be the most efficient. One load comes from Canada, one load comes from the U.S., one load is mixed. How do they handle that? Because they have to separate that. And every time you have to separate, that costs money. And then what the consumers want, they wanted it all labeled, but they don't want to pay any extra. Well, somebody's got to pay for that. So you know who pays for it? The producer. We get less money for our product because the plant has to go through the process of splitting up these loads and then get them in the right chutes and get the right label on it. That costs money. And the consumer's not going to pay, so I pay. So in my position, I don't like that idea at all. Does it make sense?
Well, it's thoughtful, and I appreciate your feedback.
Thank you.
I think it's a difficulty for smaller operations in places like Maine. I think about the lobster community, where when I talk to lobstermen and women, one of the top things that they regret is that they don't have control over processing locally. They hate to see it go to Canada, and at the end of the day, they want, for instance, Maine lobster to be labeled as such. They hate to see it go to Canada and then come back without labeling that shows that it's a U.S. Maine lobster and not a Canadian one. But
well, any packing plant can put whatever label they want. They could put, if they want only U.S., they could put U.S. on there. But I don't think there should be a regulation. If you think that's an advantage, put it on there. And if you don't think it is an advantage, don't put it on there.
Yep. No.
Just like organic or any other niche. So that's the way I would like to put it.
I appreciate the feedback, and I do want to look further into some of the things around import and export inspections in this trade deal, and whether or not it is in fact going to make sure that we've got a safe product coming in. We talked about the bird flu aspect and how it could really damage your industry significantly. And the last piece is just Buy American preferences continue to be waived under this new deal, which as the subcommittee chair on contracting and infrastructure for this committee, I think is regrettable. I'd always prefer to see an American business get the American government contract first. Unfortunately, I think under this deal, we weren't able to get that in, and so unfortunately, I think we'll continue to see competition for Buy American preferences and U.S. government taxpayer, American taxpayer, contracts purchasing Mexican and Canadian goods from the American government, or selling it to the American government, which is unfortunate. I wish we could have done something about that, and interested if you would benefit from such a policy.
Well, it comes back to cost. Where do you draw the line? I mean, if I can buy something from Japan at $10, would I pay $20 for its American? I mean, normally most of our county, when they're buying a truck for the county, they buy it the cheapest they can, because that makes our county more feasible, and it lowers the cost to the county if they buy it the cheapest one. Now, that's talking about county. When you're talking about the globe, there's chances of buying stuff from wherever. So I don't know the answer to it, and I would like to buy American too, and if I have a chance, I would too. But at what cost? That's the question.
I am out of time. I see that Mr. Nasser would like an opportunity. I leave it up to the chairwoman. Yeah, I mean, I understand what you're saying, sir. My concern, of course, is at what cost is at the end of the day, is if we lose the jobs here in the United States, then we don't have people with good work. But
But as a taxpayer in your county, you want them to keep the cost as low as they can. And in some cases, you might be willing to pay a little bit more, but where do you draw the line? That's just the question. Right.
Delicate balance, Mr. Nasser.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. I just want to say that, you know, where we believe that U.S. workers are the most productive, and it actually shows that it is, but we don't want to compete on an unlevel playing field. And what we're seeing is we don't want, it's not good when the price is a lot lower because workers are exploited. And that's what we see in Mexico, for example. I just want to emphasize that workers there who want to join a union often face violence. This is not hyperbole, it's fact. In fact, the State Department just said as much in their report, which is in my testimony. So, yes, level playing field, but at what point do we say the price is more important than everything else? So I think there's a balance to be had, and I think the exploiting workers shouldn't be a competitive advantage.
Thank you, Mr. Golden. And I also, again, want to take an opportunity to thank our witnesses here today, and very grateful for the discussion we were able to have. And again, although we all, come from different backgrounds or different viewpoints, the fact that it was a thoughtful, respectful discussion is something that, I actually think happens more in DC than we think. But it's nice to actually showcase this as well, that these are the types of discussions that should be even though they're tough ones. And but that makes them all the more important. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I also have to say, I am heartbroken hearing some of the testimony today. Ms. Dostal, I will never be able to forget you sitting here and having to tell me that you were, encouraging your sons not to go into the, to the farm. And that's tough to hear, as I'm, I've got a nephew who's about 2. He's he's the son of my sister and the brother-in-law who are corn and soybean farmers. They've got about 500 acres. And I oftentimes think about him as well, and what does his future look like, and what will they be telling him? And so it hit very close to home. And I know, Mr. Stoltzfus, I know you mentioned economies of scale and how it's changing, but the reality is, our small family farms, they are the backbone of not just our economy in Iowa, but also our culture. It is our values. It is who we are. And I am committed to fighting like hell to make sure I'm doing everything I can to preserve that way of life, as well as the way of life for our working families across the district as well. Mr. Nassar, speaking of our UAW workers and other folks in manufacturing, wages have basically been stagnant in the state of Iowa for the last 10 years. It's tough, and it's tougher every day for working families to make it. And I truly believe for America to succeed, for Iowa to succeed, this is why it's so important to come together on these issues, because we both do better when, the other one is doing better. And so, again, grateful to start these real conversations that are tough. And in regards to small businesses, we know, when we are creating new markets and new producers, we create new jobs, and we also bolster our economy, which obviously is just incredibly important across the board here in congressional districts all across our country. But if we are not taking the trade negotiations thoughtfully and carefully, and with a plan that also can have negative impacts. And so, again, I'm just grateful we are having these discussions and starting them before we even get the USMCA delivered to Congress, which we should be expecting, I'm assuming, sometime. And it's important we continue to have these discussions, as I've said. And so, one of the things as well, I just wanted to touch on that you guys all did for me quite well was, again, these long-term impacts. I am worried after just, a week ago, I had a young guy, he was 16, sort of in the same boat, I'm sure, as your sons, who told me that he's not sure if he'll be going into the family farm. He's one of 4, he's the youngest, and he's going to school for engineering, which is also important, but he was really worried. He looked at me and he talked about his community, his, the businesses in the rural area where he grew up. Again, rural communities changing all across America after the last few years, and worried about what that future looks like. So just thank you for your perspective on all of this. And I also want to make sure that we are uplifting these stories to the administration and making sure that they are hearing what has been going on the ground, and making sure that what they are doing ends up worth it in the end. And I hope to God it is. We have to take this opportunity with pending deals to make it worthwhile and make improvements where they're needed. We need a strategy for trade that is fair to our workers and our domestic industries, ensures labor protections, and opens new markets for our farmers, while leaning on our close allies for strength in the global marketplace. I know this hearing helped inform many of my thoughts, as well as the folks that were in and out here today as well. And I'm sure, again, folks watching this and hopefully our fellow colleagues we can have conversations with regarding this testimony today will benefit. I now, again, would just like to say thank you for the final time. Grateful for all of you. Please have all safe journeys back to Pennsylvania and Iowa. And I remain hopeful for the future, but we sure have a lot of work to do, and excited to have the opportunity to do it with all of you. Thank you. And with that, I'd ask unanimous consent that that members have 5 legislative days to submit statements and supporting materials for the record. Without objection, so ordered. And if there is no further business to come before this committee, we are adjourned. Thank you again to our wonderful witnesses for taking time to be here.